Okay, aloha and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're joining us from today. We're so glad that you're here to listen and learn from a few members of the rising generation of organizers and activists. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Gretchen Alther, and it is my pleasure to host this conversation today. It is also my honor to serve as the chair of the board for the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. Together with activists and movements across the country and around the world, we advocate for peace and nuclear disarmament within a framework of common security among nations. As a part of our continuous learning and discernment, we seek wisdom and insight from organizers and activists around us. Critical among these are the rising generation of leaders in the peace, justice, and climate movements. We're really excited to have 4 such leaders with us here today. In a moment, I will introduce our 4 speakers and turn the floor over to them. Each will speak to their work and the values and motivations that underpin that work, some of the biggest questions and hopes that are pulling them into the future, and their vision of the work in 10 years' time. Following their comments, we will select questions from those of you joining us today. Please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Again, use that function for questions you would like to direct to our guest speakers, and we will get to as many of those questions as we can. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Asya Maruket is a psychologist and social projects manager from Russia. Her colleagues and friends call her the daughter of Joan of Arc and Don Quixote for her readiness to help people and change society for the better. She believes in the power of nonviolent communication and embodies that belief in her activism. Our second speaker is Sean Connor. He is the Deputy Executive Director of the International Peace Bureau at its headquarters in Berlin. He holds a master's in intercultural conflict management and has worked for the Center for Cross-Cultural Study in the United States and with the Enlace Project in Nicaragua. Giselle Hertzfeld has worked as a youth advocate for progressive change in both political and nonprofit arenas. She works at the Nuclear Guardianship Campaign Coordinator for the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center and is a defunding climate disaster campaign coordinator for 350 Colorado. Nick Robb is a PhD candidate at Tufts University studying disinformation and its effects on public opinion. He has organized political education and direct action around the climate crisis and militarism and how they are fundamentally connected. As I happily turn the floor over to you 4, I am thinking about Octavia Butler's famous epigram that there's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. These words recognize that our collective struggles are long and yet call us to ever renew our hope and our vision. With that, I turn it over to Asya and ask you again to start us off by sharing with us the values and motivations that underpin your work, the questions and hopes that are pulling you into the future, and your vision for this work in 10 years' time. Asya, thank you very much.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you for all our participants. I would like to tell several words about my work, my values, and my plans. What about myself? I am a psychologist and a project manager from Russia. There are 85 regions in Russia, and I am from the one which is the smallest in Russia. It's on the North Caucasus. And I worked in non-government organizations since 2015. I was working as a psychologist. I was counseling women, and I was very excited to work as a psychologist. But when women came to me, there was often the same the same cases, and most of them they were too dangerous. And when these women came with the problems of domestic violence, or some of them were fearing of honor killings or other cruel practices which have place in our society, I was thinking about that the problem that I can't just just stay as a psychologist, that I need to do something more, something bigger to help these people. And when when woman comes to you and say that she has the problem of domestic violence, I can just I can just help her by increasing her self-consciousness, or helping her in self-care without helping to her protection. So that was the reason why I went to the non-government organizations and started my work as a project manager. What about these projects? For 7 years, I realized about 13 projects on protection of women, on women rights, human rights, on protection of children from domestic violence, including religious violence, religiously motivated violence. And this year, my work was devoted to the peace building activities, because our colleagues from Ukraine, they were very anxious about the situation long before the February, and we provide some supportive sessions for them, for sharing our experience, because in our region we also had a war and genocide experience, for sharing this experience and support them, and to tell them some words of support and our solidarity. And after February, of course, main part of my activities lays in the field of peace building, because this is the most actual topic of these days among human rights defenders and other activists. So what we do, we help with providing psychological support, legal support, sometimes support with evacuation, and all these questions which are now crucial for many people, including activists. What about my commitments and values? Mostly, as I said, mostly my experience lays in the field of women's rights. And I believe that helping women and helping vulnerable groups of society, that is what makes society more peaceful and sustainable. And my vision, my belief is sustained or supported by some research, according to which when the country is the more country is gender just, the more it is more peaceful to other countries too. So there is some they say that there is some connection between how the state behaves towards women. It can predict how the state will behave towards other countries. So I believe that helping women, in my case, it's critical, and it's important for making our state and our country more peaceful. Last years it was very hard for the society, social organizations, because the rate of persecution from government raised, and it was very difficult and hard to work in such conditions. That is why most of my colleagues, including me, we left country before the war starts, because for us and against us, this war started long before February of this year. As for my values, I have all the humanistic values, I can say, because my profession and my work, my experience taught me to appreciate the human. I believe in human dignity and in human rights, and this is the value which can be easily underestimated sometimes by the politics. And I believe that activists, human rights defenders, and non-government, just civil society, is the main part, which work is to let the values of human dignity and human rights to win, and to have some power over political ambitions. This is what about my values. And as for my plan, I had a plan to build or to take part in building some strong institutions, because institutions is what prevent your country and your society from being aggressive, from giving all the power to one man, in the hands of one man, and as consequence to destroy this country. And I was focused on the building institutions, building strong communities, but the situation, what happened in February, they changed, I believe, plans of all of us, but I still have this dream, and I still have this plan that I will be able to build some strong, peaceful community and institution together with my colleagues from my country and from other countries too. So it's a short introduction for myself. If you have questions, please feel free to ask me.
Asya, thank you. We will please use the question and answer function if you have questions for Asya or any of our subsequent speakers. Want to again welcome those of you who have just joined us. We are here today to learn from the rising generation of activists and organizers, and we're asking each of them to speak to their work and the values and motivations that underpin that work, some of the biggest questions and hopes that are pulling them into the future, and their vision of their work in 10 years' time. Following all of their commentary, we'll have a chance to address some of the questions that you have for them. So again, thank you. And thank you, Asya. It's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Sean Connor. Sean, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to quickly mention for Asya, who just spoke, that the organization I'm coming from, the International Peace Bureau, has awarded her, alongside one of our common colleagues in Ukraine, Yuri Shelyazenko, some of you may know him, with the Sean McBride Peace Prize for 2022. I'll post a link, and maybe that can be shared later as well with the audience here. But I just want to congratulate her again. She's been doing amazing work and fully deserves the award. So congratulations, Asya, on everything you're doing. Now, a little bit of, I'm going to start a little bit with my background, going back maybe a little bit too far, but when I was 9 years old, September 11th, 2001 happened. And one of my earliest memories I have for writing a paper for school, and it's a heavy topic for a 9-year-old, but this was a question of whether we should or should not retaliate against supposedly the Taliban, although, you know, the details really of the situation were not all too clear as a child. But I think I've always been a bit of an idealist, because I answered that question with a resounding no, with absolutely no compromise in my heart. So that's kind of my earliest memory as well of being a peace activist. Now, it was still decades after that before I really became involved in work, but another little funny anecdote is my first semester in college for my bachelor's degree, I dropped out of my intro to international relations course because I thought it was a bit too militaristic in its tone, and it wasn't interesting to me. I ended up switching my major to communication and focused on intercultural and critical studies of communication, and had a minor in international relations coming out of it. So I ended up retaking that intro course and some others. And still, I wasn't really convinced of what I wanted to do work-wise, professionally, until just after my bachelor's degree. I moved down to Nicaragua, where I lived for 2 years. And many people are familiar with the 1979 revolution, Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. The following 10 years of the Contra revolution, or the civil war within the country, which was aided by the US quite heavily, and under which there were terrible, horrendous human rights violations, countless innocent civilians who were killed. And really the campaign was less so to try to retake the government and more so to sow chaos within the society. Now that's one thing, but also if you look at the longer history of Nicaragua, it has been centuries of civil wars and conflicts within the country, which has prevented the country from developing, has had a heavy toll for the average citizen within Nicaragua, and to this day reflects a little bit in the way that they perceive their own country and the world. And this was the moment where really I knew the importance of peace for me, and where I knew that was my path forward. So I did my master's in intercultural conflict management here in Berlin, and then ended up with an intern position with the International Peace Bureau in 2020, right as the pandemic was coming down on us all. For IPB, this was a challenge, but also an opportunity to kind of grow as an organization. Typically, just a little background on the International Peace Bureau. We are a 130-year-old organization founded in 1891. We won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1910 before the 2 world wars. So it's been a difficult past century or so of work since then. And over the years, we've had many different campaigns, but really the central focus of IPB has been to be an international peace network, a forum or a space where peace organizations, primarily at its founding in Europe, and a little bit in the quote unquote Western worlds, but since then that has been growing much larger, with the idea to connect these organizations, not necessarily that we have to agree on everything or participate in the same actions, but really to have that conversation with each other, to share tools, experience, and knowledge. And this was done through conferences. At one point they were held annually. Now we hold a World Peace Congress every 5 years. The last one was just last year in Barcelona. Some of you may be familiar with that as well. In addition to that, we have another a range of different activities and campaigns that we run. So one of the most famous or well-known ones is the GCOMS campaign, or the Global Campaign on Military Spending. This is a campaign that runs mostly as sort of awareness, but also actions to make people aware of how much money, over 2 trillion, spent around the globe on the military, and then also to organize protests and different things coordinated during the Global Days of Action on Military Spending every year. Just recently, we also have a new project on common security, or a report that came out originally in 1982, 40 years ago, at sort of a height in the Cold War. And the paper, which had experts from the East and the West come together to draft a number of recommendations, served as sort of a guideline to reducing nuclear weapons. Many of the nuclear weapons agreements that came about in the 1980s, for example, were referenced within common security. And now we're seeking again to bring common security into the light of the public. As we see, again, global military spending rising, a lot of the nuclear agreements that came into force have either lost their potency or been put away and left to the side in favor of increasing or making more deadly nuclear weapons. But also the new report seeks to go beyond the kind of East-West polarity of the Cold War to really address global problems that we have now, including the threats of climate change, including inequality and human rights and other concerns. So we build those into the reports and also have a regionalization of the idea of common security, that it doesn't mean the same thing in every context. We, of course, are working on a number of other issues. I mentioned the Sean McBride Peace Prize before, a prize that we give out to extraordinary peace activists and organizations every year. And we, of course, are working quite heavily at the moment on Ukraine as well. One of those efforts is to bring the voices for peace together from both Ukraine and Russia, as well as surrounding countries in Eastern Europe, excuse me, and Central Asia. And Asya has also been a part of those conversations, which is much appreciated. In terms of what we see really for the future of IPB, the vision I have, of course, it's multifold. There are many different points to bring in. One of the most talked about issues of our time now is the growing Cold War rhetoric or positioning between the US and China. This isn't going away anytime soon and is likely to get worse. And it's something we really need to work hard to avoid the worst, or to, some people would call it already a Cold War, and in some ways it is. But there are so many risks that things could spiral down very quickly. And so it has to be a central point of our future work to do everything we can to avoid the situation from getting worse, promoting dialogue and cooperation where it's possible, etc. We also, of course, have to react to climate change. Although we're in the peace movement, climate change both is impacted by the military and can cause more in-depth or more severe conflicts over resources, over migration patterns, and other changes that climate change will bring with it. So it's intensely linked with peace work, which is quite important. We also need to be aware of technological developments that are making warfare more dangerous and even targeting new groups that previously maybe not, were not on the battlefield, but there's, just to name a few, hypersonic missiles, the growing threat of cyber attacks of all sorts, autonomous weapon systems and artificial intelligence, and weapons in space as well, satellite destroyers. All these could risk immediate escalation of conflict for being misinterpreted, even leading to possibly nuclear war if, for example, a nuclear detection system were to be compromised through a cyber attack. So those are, of course, threats that are quite important. And more generally speaking, warfare as it has been fought in the past is not the warfare necessarily of the future. I'm reading a book at the moment, and I don't mean too much to do a promotion here, but it is quite an interesting read called The Weaponization of Everything. And it's really the idea that there are so many new tools of war that previously we wouldn't consider, electrical grids that could go offline. As we just saw this past week, the exploding of a pipeline. Now, we don't know all the details surrounding that yet, but that alone, some may consider an act of war or an act of aggression that could escalate things as well. So there's all sorts of new issues around warfare that we have to take into account for peace. There's also the issue of forever wars, or wars that continue to go on through generation and generation. It's something the UN and Antonio Guterres talk a lot about as well. There are really no ends to these conflicts in sight, and that's incredibly scary. And we often focus all our energy on kind of the bigger conflicts, or the ones that we have some sort of personal stake in, whether it be that the US is shipping arms to Saudi Arabia to use in Yemen, or whatever it may be. But there are so many civil wars or conflicts that are not quite wars, but are quite violent still. And these need to be addressed when we talk about peace. So really a global perspective is absolutely needed. And then lastly, the increasing isolation between international actors, where if you have an adversary, you're inclined not to speak directly with them. Maybe you have your military alliances that you're using, or just the breakdown of multilateralism on the international stage, and dialogue in general is something that's incredibly important to address. And a lot of these issues kind of flow directly into what we're doing now, but they're all issues that will increase in importance in the coming years and that are quite frightening. How much time do I have left? Sorry, I've lost track a little bit here.
Yeah, no worries. You have a couple minutes.
Okay. So then I'll just talk a little bit more about personally kind of where I see myself in 5 or 10 years. Next month, I will be taking over as the executive director of the International Peace Bureau, a role that comes with a lot of pressure, quite intimidating in some ways, but also a lot of opportunities. So definitely for the next 5 years, perhaps the next 10, to be seen. I'm hoping to stick with the IPB and to help drive these programs and insights forward. One thing I would really like to see for the IPB would be to increase our ability to network between our members. We have a very large network of around 400 member organizations in around 80 countries. This could always grow. We're always looking to grow. And currently we're focused a lot on kind of national civil society movements. I would be really interested to have our network more in communication with each other, to really share what works well for them, what didn't work well, to learn from one another, to bring them together for events and activities, and also bring in voices from the movements around us, from the climate movements, from social and racial injustice, or the movements fighting for justice. That's quite important to peace as well. Something we've been working a lot towards lately is this idea that you can't have peace without justice and justice without peace. And so I think that needs to be essential for the future of our movement as a whole. This also means, in terms of peace movement in general, we've been historically separated from peace building networks. There are those that are in organizations working to build peace, but somehow this gets separated from those of us who are marching in the streets for peace. And I think there needs to be more connection there, for example, as well. And just bringing this community together. Common security, I really do see as one of the most important tools that IPB has to address these many issues. Really, the center point of common security is that no nation can be safe or make itself feel secure at the expense of another nation's security. And if this is really a basic understanding, I want something like this to be taught in this introduction to international relations course, because it's something that we often forget about. We get caught in these basic theories of international relations about why we're always fighting, but we don't look at, what's the alternative? And that's where common security comes in. So I would really like to bring the conversation around common security to not only academics, but also those in different civil society movements, the political spheres, lobbying, etc. And just one last thing, and I'll end here. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and how I would love in 10 years to see all of the current nuclear armed nations to be signed up and ratified to the TPNW. Thank you.
Sean, thank you very much. And to those of you who are putting your questions into the question function, thank you. Please continue to do so. As you hear things you have questions about for our speakers, please put your questions in there, and then we will get to those as we can. Again, Sean, thank you. And Giselle, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Giselle Hirschfeld, and I am a full-time activist based out of Colorado in the United States. And for the past 2 years, I've been working for 2 nonprofit organizations. One is called the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, where I work primarily on opposing nuclear weapons and nuclear power. And the other is 350 Colorado, where I work primarily on fossil fuel divestment and climate change issues. And really, for me, it has always felt like a moral imperative to try and tackle the biggest existential issues facing our planet. I think we're at a really exciting and really terrifying turning point in human history, where the decisions that we make right now will dramatically shape what the planet will look like for future generations. So I can start by giving just some context about who I am and what led me to do this work. When I was very young, I learned that my ancestors had experienced the horrors of genocide on every side of my family. So my great-grandfather died in Germany as a Jew in a concentration camp, and my grandmother's family escaped Ukraine during Soviet rule. Her family escaped the Holodomor, which was a hunger genocide in Ukraine. And on my mother's side, I'm a mix of the Spanish and indigenous blood that arose from the colonization of indigenous people in Mexico. So I think from a young age, this awareness of my own ancestral history in many ways instilled a sense of needing to fight for justice for all living things on a planetary scale. When I was 9 years old, my parents took me to go see a screening of the film An Inconvenient Truth. And for those who haven't seen it, it was really the first major film to call out the climate crisis as a global existential emergency. And watching this film as a kid was absolutely terrifying. Not only was the content of the film terrifying, but it also struck me that I was sitting in a room full of adults, and I was completely baffled at the fact that major scientists, political leaders, and the general public were aware of this climate crisis, but I did not see drastic action being taken by society to change the trajectory in which we were headed. And I think watching this film was really a catalyzing moment for me in becoming a climate activist, because as a very young person, I saw climate change as the biggest existential threat of our time. But then as I grew up, I realized that the problems were so much deeper than just climate change. And everywhere I looked, I began to see the echoes of corporate control, environmental exploitation, racial injustice, militarism. The list goes on. And I really wanted to try and understand how all of these problems were linked together, because I felt like, there's all these existential problems, and there's got to be something that connects them all, so that we can tackle all of them simultaneously. And then it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I also learned about the existential threat of nuclear weapons and nuclear waste. It was then that I learned for the first time in my life that I had grown up less than 10 miles north of Rocky Flats, which was a facility that during the Cold War produced 70,000 plutonium pits, which are the radioactive core of our entire nuclear weapons arsenal here in the United States. And it was then that I learned that the threat of nuclear war was not just an issue of past generations, but was still a very real and very tangible threat, not only from the threat of nuclear weapons being used, but also even in the case that they're not used, there's 100,000, hundreds of thousands of years of radioactive legacy that their production and testing have left and continue to leave. So now I'm working for two nonprofits tackling what on the surface seem to be two very different existential issues, but I'm learning more and more how they are inextricably linked. And I believe they're linked in a paradigm of greed, power imbalances, and really at its core, it's our human tendency to view others as other, whether it's an ecosystem seen as other, or another animal seen as other, or a person seen as other. And I'll get into a little more about how that guides my perspective as an activist. But first, I'll go into a little more detail about the issues that I'm trying to tackle in my work. And then I'll discuss the change that I see as needed for the future that we need to collectively create together. So I'll start with climate change. Growing up in Colorado, I've seen very beautiful and very unique ecosystems become desecrated by extractive industries. Here in Colorado, we have seen a massive expansion of fracking in my lifetime, and I've just seen so many vibrant communities like mine becoming increasingly drained by the oil and gas wells in our backyards. And I'm sure many of you have heard about the latest IPCC report, which could not be clearer that if we're to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and avert the most devastating effects of the climate crisis, there can be no expansion of coal, oil, and gas production. And a recent International Energy Agency report defined no new investment in fossil fuel supply projects starting today as critical for net zero emissions by 2050, which could hopefully keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So it's clear that financiers need to immediately stop investing in fossil fuel expansion. Yet, despite this warning from the global scientific community, Wall Street banks, pension funds, and governments continue to invest trillions of dollars in fossil fuels. And just in the last 6 years since the Paris Climate Agreement, the world's 60 largest banks have poured $4.6 trillion into fossil fuels. We're seeing all over the world that climate disasters are having catastrophic consequences everywhere, with frontline indigenous communities, communities of color, and communities in the global South being hit the hardest, despite contributing the least to the crisis. And here in Colorado, where I live, I've seen climate impacts increasing dramatically year by year. Just last December, my own county witnessed the most destructive wildfire in Colorado's history. But every year leading up to that had catastrophic wildfires as well. We had wildfire season, which at this point has just turned into wildfire year, where you go outside, there's ash raining down from the sky, and the sky is, almost black with how much smoke there is during the day. And, seeing the impacts in my home state, but then realizing that it's not here, it's everywhere, and it's happening right now. And it's just a really stark warning of what is to come if we do not rapidly transition off of fossil fuels. So I'm currently leading several fossil fuel divestment campaigns to get our state, county, and local governments to remove funding from fossil fuels. But then on the climate solutions side, I'm also witnessing an unsettling move in the United States towards promoting nuclear power as the solution to the climate crisis. So here in the US, we're seeing proposals to close down coal plants and replace them with nuclear power plants. So I'm also helping to lead a campaign to halt these nuclear proposals in favor of renewable energy for several reasons. But we're really seeing the US Department of Energy now promoting a transition to nuclear power. And a lot of people believe this is the solution to the climate crisis, but nuclear power is a fatally flawed option because it creates waste that remains radioactive for thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, leaving a toxic legacy for many, many generations. And at this point, there is no good solution for processing or storing radioactive waste. And the proposals so far entail creating interim storage facilities that threaten local communities, particularly indigenous communities in the Southwest United States. And many of these are the same communities who are still experiencing the toxic legacy of uranium mining during the Cold War, where babies on the Navajo reservation, for example, are still born with very, very high levels of uranium in their blood and urine. Nuclear powers use a lot of water for cooling spent fuel and also for energy generation. We're experiencing a water crisis here in Colorado, and also, many parts of the world. We're experiencing a clean water crisis. Nuclear power has also been linked to higher rates of cancer, and we've seen incredibly horrible catastrophes from nuclear power plants gone wrong at Chernobyl and at Fukushima. And with the rise of climate disasters, it's harder and harder to find safe places that will not be threatened by flooding or wildfires or some natural disaster, which, if they happened in a place with a nuclear power plant, could be exponentially more catastrophic. But another reason that I oppose nuclear power is because nuclear power and nuclear weapons are deeply linked, since plutonium is a byproduct of nuclear power production. And right now in the United States, we've committed up to $2 trillion over the next 30 years to modernize our nuclear weapons arsenal, which can only lead to more destruction and a continuation of our toxic, extractive, and war-based paradigm. The U.S. Department of Defense is also the largest energy consumer in the U.S. and the world's largest consumer of petroleum, so also a major contributor to the climate crisis. So we're at this point in history where we're faced with all of these massive existential threats, and it could all be seen as very, very bleak. And as a young person, I've noticed that it can be really easy to fall into nihilism and burnout and to think, oh, these problems are too massive, I can't do anything. But I think we're at a major turning point in society where we are seeing this massive paradigm shift begin to emerge. And I've been reading this beautiful book by Joanne Macy called Active Hope. I would suggest that everyone read it, especially if they're feeling overwhelmed by the crises that we're currently facing globally. And there's one part of the book where she discusses the fact that change is not a linear progression. So she gives this beautiful metaphor of a glass bottle of water in a freezer. And the metaphor goes, if you fill a glass bottle with water and you put it in the freezer, for the first several hours, the bottle looks basically the same. You'll pull the bottle out of the freezer and check on it, and it doesn't look like much change is happening. But then gradually the bottle is getting colder and colder, and then suddenly small crystals begin to emerge in the water. And then suddenly, in a very short period of time, these few crystals begin to grow and spread, and soon the whole bottle is filled with these crystals, and then the bottle eventually shatters, and this all happens very quickly. And I love this metaphor because it's exactly what I see happening right now. It's really easy to get discouraged when you look around and you see all of these problems, but I think we're in the midst of a paradigm shift right now where people all over the world are beginning to wake up and realize the emergency that we're in and develop a new sense of a collective identity. And I think we have everything it takes right now to change the trajectory of our society and to create a beautiful future. And I think it'll take every one of us learning about the problems and having the courage to step up and be a part of the solution. And I had one more thing to close with, but I want to make sure that I, just do a time check really quick.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to close with a personal experience that I had 6 years ago that completely changed how I viewed my place in the world, and that gave me a really clear vision of what I see the new paradigm becoming. And I think, you know, in many ways, my work focuses very much on political issues, but I think there's also a spiritual component that can't be ignored. And I really realized this 6 years ago when I was in a car accident and I had a near-death experience that completely shattered my view of my own individual identity and my place in the world. I remember after this car accident happened, there was a moment where I was on the cusp between life and death, and I felt myself becoming free of the bounds of my own body and completely connected with everything around me. And I woke up with this new sense that I'm not just this individual being having an individual experience, but that I'm actually a part of this vast, expansive universe, and I'm profoundly connected with everything around me. And I really see this understanding of a collective identity as a key piece of the puzzle in creating this new paradigm and tackling all these issues that we're experiencing. So I envision a future where people all over the world have a collective identity that's rooted in equality, mutual respect, and justice, where people don't see themselves just as individuals pursuing their own individual needs and interests, but as a collective part of the world, whose needs and experiences are rooted in a love and connection with everything and everyone around them. So I'll just close by urging all viewers today to think about what that means to exist in a world with an understanding that you're not separate from everything around you. And I think that is what's going to propel us into the new paradigm that we need to see.
Giselle, thank you very much. And thank you for sharing so much of yourself here. It is my pleasure to turn it to our fourth speaker today. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Gretchen. Yeah, Giselle, I'm going to be thinking about that glass bottle metaphor for so long. Joanne and Macy is on point with that one. That's a really, really good metaphor. Yeah, I want to thank everyone so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Nick. I use he, him pronouns. I'm calling in from Somerville, Massachusetts, on Pawtucket, Massachusetts land. And I'm here, well, I'm here to talk about, I guess, sort of my journey to coming to understand and sort of have painted a picture of what I think we're up against today, that some of the other speakers have articulated really beautifully, and what I think we should be doing about it. I have, for the past handful of years, I've done a lot of climate organizing, so I share that with some of my co-panelists. I organized with the Sunrise Movement for a long time, fighting for a Green New Deal, trying to organize around me in Boston. And I saw this incredible sort of arc occur in the US and sort of kind of that rippled out all over the world, as I think there were some moments in 2018, 2019, where there's a huge sort of whirlwind moment where so many people gained this sort of consciousness about the climate crisis as something really, really pressing, existentially threatening in a way that was kind of like that glass bottle where it kind of snapped all of a sudden. And there are many moments like this. I think this is how things tend to change. I think Joanne Macy is totally right about that. So I was a part of this, but I saw sort of the climate movement, as much as it, had sort of a crystallization and freezing arc. It also had a bit of a decline, I think, that we've seen in the past few years. And I really, as I was organizing, wanted to understand this decline. And that's what I've been doing these past few years. And hopefully it's useful to you all. Because at the same time, I had been doing anti-militarist organizing as well, working on sort of some peace campaigns and education campaigns, as well as, sort of in the past few years, participating in some direct actions against military industrial companies and, arms of the US state sort of complex that are, at play in these types of things. And through my sort of climate and anti-militarism work, I came to, try to understand what had happened to the climate movement through the lens of militarism, and realized that it's not just true for the climate movement, but it's actually true for, I think, all sort of movements for change, that there are very intricate and well-functioning systems of domination that we're fighting against, that are, not just the military, but also the police, systems of propaganda, systems of class inequality, systems of political control, et cetera, et cetera. Which coincidentally, I mean, it's a tiny little piece of my bio, but I do, for my PhD, study disinformation, which you could also call propaganda, which is sort of a form of intellectual domination. But suffice to say, I started seeing all of these systems as really well-functioning and interconnected, and standing to sort of squash whatever organizing we can come up with. Even huge whirlwind moments like sunrises failed to culminate in anything that even resembled climate justice, right? Let's see. I was part of also a movement a couple summers ago, led by Indigenous women and Two-Spirit organizers at the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota, protesting a pipeline, trying to protect their land and fight for climate justice, totally crushed by the police, local police, who are paid by the corporation who was building the pipeline. So I started seeing all these ways that when we push, they push back, which may sound incredibly obvious, but I think actually we don't take seriously enough. So this is what I've been working on lately, is that I think if we're going to address any of these issues, we have to sort of we have to build those crystals in ways that I don't think we're quite doing right now. Because if we don't have enough crystals, we're never gonna shatter the bottle, because the bottle actually is like 6 layers of bottles that knows how to like dry up the water and section little pieces of water away from each other and individualize the crystals. So I've been really thinking and working on sort of 3 main things, which I feel that they sound quite obvious, but I think we really need to double down on them, which is building community wherever it needs to exist to address the issues that we face in our own lives, whether that means in our schools, at our workplaces, in our families, blah, blah, blah. Use these communities, bringing people in to facilitate political education and build a consciousness, sort of like Giselle was saying, this shared consciousness, but then crucially taking action, which I think is something that in a lot of spaces I see is missing a little bit. We can talk a lot, and that's really important, but at the end of the day, we need to take different types of actions. And I think this is the difficult work, that is that non-linear type of change that was quoted to Joanne Macy, that we can't just solve these problems overnight, but we really need to do the incredibly difficult work to sew back together our society that has been pulled apart basically over the past 40 years, 40, 50 years. And I should say I spent way too long on that part, but I got into this work and I really started finding it as something that I think brought my life a lot of meaning. Sort of similarly to the story Giselle shared, is that I think my family background brought me a lot of this. I grew up hearing stories from my father, who's Pakistani, about a lot of conflict, a lot of violence in the country, and sort of his struggle as he came to the US and was viewed as a foreigner, and really only got by because of the kindness of others and the cooperative spirit of other people. And also heard it from my mother's side, Italian side, who further ago were viewed as that non-white other and racialized in that way, and were treated as sort of poor immigrants, as total low-class citizens. So these stories, I think, instilled values in me of working towards cooperation and working towards equity and distribution of resources, and breaking down these divisions that are built between us, whether that's based on race or class or gender or anything they can use to divide us. But also, crucially, I really work from a place that is really rooted in this belief that people need to go on, I think, a journey of sort of growth. And I feel that it's a terrible way to say it, because I feel it's one of these psychology things that have been co-opted by popular culture, but I wanted to say self-actualization. I feel like that's become kind of annoying for me to say these days, but I think people, we as a society really need to, encourage people to find this desire to make meaning in the world, because people already have it. It just gets squashed, right, by our societies. And then, another value that this all sort of inculcated in me is a value to take action, try to do something about it, because I do not want people to, have to go through the suffering that I see and personally have felt in certain ways. So, in the end, I think the most important issues that we face today are sort of what I laid out, that we can organize, but there are these incredibly well-organized systems that we're fighting against. And this is a very US-centric lens, but I think it extends sort of to the Western world generally, in Europe a little more, and a bit across the globe. But we who are fighting for peace and disarmament and security, or against the climate crisis, we're fighting sort of the neoliberal central establishment that has been so dominant for 50 years, that wants to depoliticize everything and individualize everybody, but also this really frightening growing threat of increased sort of far right movements around the world, especially in the US, where these politics are taking hold because societies are decaying and inequality is rampant and people are having pretty low quality of life, and looking for answers and getting totally tricked by these these far right movements. So I think we're fighting a two-front battle that is going to be incredibly difficult, which is why we need to truly double down on, when rights are taken away, we need to connect with each other and build mutual aid networks to help each other out, which does the double movement of helping people to provide resources and building tighter knit community. Because all the while, the society is going to be pulling us apart and trying to individualize us and trying to pit us against each other, while it inevitably destroys the planet and militarizes all the way along and fights wars to over scarcer and scarcer resources. So we will never get through it unless we are committing to building really strong communities and trying to get everyone on the same page, and then building enough hope that we can take action and that we can change these things. And I realize I'm pretty far out of time, but that's what I hope to be doing. What was it? It's hard to think about in 5 or 10 years, because you could just have another pandemic wipe away like 5 years of your life all of a sudden. But if I were to try to think about the work I want to do, 5 or 10 years from now, I think it's just trying to work to build, to encourage people to be able to make space in their lives for building these types of communities and skills. So we can kind of build the power and the engine that needs to exist to do the work that we need to do to address the issues that were already talked about by the other panelists. Yeah, that's it.
Nick, thank you very much. And Asya, Sean, Giselle, thank you as well. I'll start out with a couple of questions, and I'm torn because I have both very particular individual questions and bigger sort of collective questions. And I'll start with a collective one because I think it connects to some of the questions we have in the chat. I was watching this week again the incredible documentary film Dolores about Dolores Huerta's activism in the 60s, and how she and Cesar Chavez and their co-activists built an incredible movement. Still one of the best examples of boycotts that we've seen in protection of laborers, and how she indeed made space for people to self-actualize, to understand their place in the system, how the system did or didn't support them. Just an incredible documentary. For those of you who have not seen it, it's just another recommendation coming out of our conversation today. Just incredibly inspiring, and shows that this is indeed long-term work, and it's big system work, even as it connects to us as individuals. So the question, maybe from the perspective of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, we're quite interested in this, in these crystals, or in these levers, right? How do we, what are the levers, or what are the crystals that we can collectively work on? And Jim Anderson here in the chat, coming off of Giselle's conversation, asks if peace activists could take up raising the plight of nuclear power, perhaps as one of those crystals or one of those levers. So the question to the four of you, and I'll let you jump in as you see fit. What are those levers, or what are those crystals that our different campaigns and our different actions should be paying attention to, or can be paying attention to try to explode that bottle? Who would like to take that? Sean, please.
Yes, I can start. I'm sure others will have something to say. I think I'm going to turn again to the Common Security Report that we released earlier this year in answering the question. We set out a number of recommendations that to us, at least in terms of militarism and on the global scale, could be reduced. And most of these, they're basically divided into 4 sections. One is more or less a new global social contract, and this has more bold ideas such as reforming the UN Security Council that are unlikely to happen in the near term, but still necessary changes for a better system overall, as well as things such as disarmament for development and the need to funnel money into social services, for the survival of our population. I think that would be, of course, one big step that could be taken. We don't need to stop militarism over, from day to night in order to work towards a world without war. What we need to do is take steps towards reducing our reliance on militarism. We need to, reduce the number of nuclear weapons. They're not going to disappear overnight. They will, we hope that they will eventually, but for nuclear weapons, for example, a starting point really is reductions between the US and Russia, because these countries have a multitude of nuclear weapons, more than any of the other nuclear weapons nations. So, the steps can start even with just 2 countries that agree on mutual reductions. And this was done during the Cold War. gradually over time, and we need to continue that process. What happened is the Cold War ended, and both sides ended up over time getting more bold. The U.S. in particular kind of felt its role as a unipolar system was that they could again resort to their nuclear weapons. We need a continued process and continued dialogue between nations, and that's one of the most important steps there. We need agreements on not expanding weapons in space. There's an outer space treaty that does forbid such weapons to a certain degree, but not as elaborated as it could be. So this outer space treaty basically needs now an ongoing discussion of new technologies that are coming about and how to deal with those. For example, also mining in space is something that now is beginning to be talked about as a potential option for resources and could lead to conflicts quite quickly. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but getting back to some of these levers or crystals, I think really dialogue for me is the central key to it all. If nations are speaking with each other and using dialogue more readily than they're willing to use military defense, this is the step that kind of works over time to decrease militarism and find solutions in other ways.
Thank you, John. Nick, Asya, or Giselle, any answers to that or responses to that question? And Giselle, I would point out that, again, there have been some specific questions to you, but perhaps to all of you, as to whether activists can take up the nuclear power issue within the peace movement.
Yeah, so I can attempt to answer both of those pieces of questions. So I guess to start with the question about levers, I think we really need to look inward. I think every panelist today has shared a personal story or catalyzing moments that drove them to action. And I would extend that to every person viewing this panel today. Everyone has a personal story and a personal stake in tackling these existential issues that we're experiencing. And there are so many issues that affect so many people in so many ways. And I think it's important to come to this work from a place of identifying your personal story and your personal stake, because I think everyone has a very beautiful personal narrative that they can come to this work with. And I think that personal stake and that personal story really is grounding in identifying what drives you and what your personal skills are and what your personal experience are and what your stories are, and really come from that place to tackle these issues. I really think that the existential issues that we're facing, the success or not success of, the success or failure of our activism right now collectively, like as a global society, I think our success will be determined by people's drive and by people's, being driven towards action, which will come from identifying a personal narrative and a personal understanding. So I would very much encourage everyone to look inward and identify that catalyzing moment and really hold that as your rock as you go forward in the world and really go to make change in whatever issue personally drives you. And secondly, to address the nuclear power issue, I think nuclear power is a very, very important issue right now. Yeah, we're seeing kind of I really understand nuclear power to be kind of almost a nexus between the nuclear weapons and the climate change issues, because as I mentioned, the Department of Energy right now is pushing, and I can only speak from a US perspective, but I assume this is happening in other places as well. But the Department of Energy in the US that is both in control of the nuclear power industry and also the department that produces nuclear weapons, you're seeing this push towards transitioning away from coal plants and into nuclear power plants. And like I mentioned, I believe this is very deeply tied to our push to modernize our nuclear weapons arsenal. there's $1.7 trillion or $1.7 to $2 trillion that's been committed to modernize our nuclear weapons arsenal. And I think nuclear power is a key part of that in a way that lots of people aren't realizing. So I think it is absolutely essential that peace groups really take this issue. Peace groups and climate groups, I think, both have a stake in this nuclear power issue. So I would definitely encourage groups and activists to tie that into their messaging, because I think that is kind of a nexus right now between the nuclear issues and the climate issue.
Excellent, thank you, Giselle. Nick and Asya, feel free to answer this question. I do want to move on. We have some wonderful questions in the question and answer, as well as a lot of gratitude and love coming your way. To Asya, a much more personal question, and it is quite possible that the rest of you have a response to this kind of question. But Asya, we're curious if you could talk a little bit more about your departure from Russia and how you do your work from outside the country, insofar as you can share that.
As I said, me and my colleagues, many of us left Russia, I think last year, September, October, and in previous time, because the repression. I believe that war doesn't start from attacking other countries, but it always starts from inner repressions against the society and social workers, activists, human rights defenders, and this part of society. So in Russia, it happened in this way because we experienced a persecution from policy representatives. There were persecution from different parts of society, and we didn't feel enough safe and comfort to continue our work. That caused our departure in different countries. Now we try to continue our work in online format, because now it's what we can do, because we don't want just to leave and forget all what happened there, and to leave the people who are still in need, who still needs our support and help. And we realize our plans in online formats, in online projects, educational projects, and supportive projects in different formats, in different ways, which are now affordable for us. And talking about the previous question, I would like to say from the perspective, from psychological perspective, I think that individual processes, somehow they work at the societal level as well, and the existential questions which we face, climate change and nuclear weapon, these cases, these questions, they can generate anxiety and fear that drive people on individual and societal level to aggression. And an adequate and constructive response and solution to this concern can be just an international dialogue, support, and joint decision in response to modern challenges. I think that we can start this solution with such small initiatives, small and big initiatives, using all the ways of interaction and cooperation available to us. That's what I just wanted to add. Thank you,
Asya, for adding all of that. Nick, please feel free to jump in. I'm going to put another question out there. I know we're going to get to the half hour and feel like we didn't have enough time with you. So I'm going to put a few questions out there, and then please feel free to answer them, any of you, as you see fit. The first is from one of our participants here, one of our listeners, Amy Blumenshire, who asks, how do we unmask the outrageous wishful thinking that pretends we'll find solutions to radioactive waste disposal or that nuclear weapons can exist without proliferating and being used. So how do we show the truth around that? And then a second question, another participant, another listener here, Nidia Leaf, has asked if there is a role for labor and unions to work toward a solution to some of the major challenges that we face that you four have been speaking to. She asked that specifically within the United States, but of course, that question we can broaden globally. Great, so two really big questions. Over to you four again.
Well, I can jump in because it can be my turn in the order. I can speak. Well, first I'll speak to the excellent question, is there a role for labor unions? And I would say, I think it's right to say labor unions everywhere, not just specifically in the US, but even, some of the folks are calling in from places where, well, Sean is calling in from a place where unions are stronger than in the US, but there are plenty of places all over the world where they are not as well. Yeah, in some of my work, I've read from other very smart people that there are good arguments that unions and sort of building that type of solidarity in places of labor are excellent ways to sort of do that kind of work that leads to action being taken, like building community, learning how to meet people where they're at, learning what issues are on people's minds, building connections that are cross-class, that are multiracial, that are, not just you sticking in your own bubble, because in some ways, labor spaces are spaces where, spaces that are sometimes more diverse than our own sort of social circles. But don't let the bosses catch on to that. Maybe they'll take that away soon. But I think, this is a type of organizing that has really stood the test of time and has been historically very feared as well by institutions and states who are sort of dedicated to undermining democracy. And because labor unions are explicitly a form of organizing that are much more democratic than the status quo. So I think there's absolutely a role for them, or similar types of organizing, even for things that don't take place in the workplace. You know what? I'll stop there. I won't even talk about radioactive waste disposal.
Thank you, Nick. Sean, please.
Just to add on briefly to the trade union or labor union discussion, being located here in Germany and as an international organization, we've spent the past few years now developing a very, very strong connection with international trade unions. This is on one hand the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation, as well as UNI Global Union, which together represents a large portion of trade unions around the world. We also are partnering at the moment with Education International, the Teachers International Trade Union. So we find these connections to be incredibly important, and they've been very supportive. When I speak about the Common Security 2022 report, IPB did not write that alone. We had two partners in that project. One was the Olof Palme International Center in Sweden, and the other one is the ITUC, the International Trade Union Confederation. So they were directly involved in the drafting and release of the reports, helping us to bring in a lot of the social elements that are not the specialty of IPB as an organization. So really, the partnership is important for both of us to learn from each other and to keep that in mind. The one other thing that's incredibly important when we talk about trade unions is there are trade unions on the international and national levels for those who are working in the arms industry. And this is not a bad thing. It is important to include them in the conversation. These are people whose livelihoods, their entire lives, their families, are living because they are manufacturing these weapons. And when we talk about a reduction in military spending, a reduction in militarization, that means there will be less jobs in the field. And so we need to be in dialogue with these people and talk about what we call a just transition, the need to really have these people maintain their livelihoods even as defense spending decreases. And we have a balloon of military spending right now, especially in the US. The arms industry is an enormous employer, and so this is something that's incredibly important, because without that we can't really expect those people to come along and agree that we need to move away from such large military spending. So I would say trade unions, labor unions have a central role in the peace movement, and building those connections on the international level has gone great. I know in the US context in particular, it's a little bit more difficult, but there's fertile ground for that to be done, and the conversations should be happening.
Thank you, Sean. Giselle.
Yeah, I also wanted to address the labor and unions question. I think that one really, really exciting and prominent role that labor unions can play on the climate change issue is unions and labor representatives have a lot of power in decisions around where pensions invest their money. And pensions are investing billions of dollars currently across the US, and I assume globally as well, investing billions and billions of dollars in fossil fuels. And right now I'm leading a pension divestment campaign here in Colorado, where we're trying to get the Colorado State Pension Fund to divest from fossil fuels. They have about $2 billion invested in fossil fuels currently. And just in my own campaigning experience, one of the biggest pushbacks we've received are from labor groups who are nervous about how fossil fuel divestment will impact their pension funds and their pension returns. So right now we are working really hard to try and get labor and unions more on board, because when it comes to the decisions that this pension fund makes, labor representatives and unions really carry a lot of weight in the financial decisions that are made. And I know not just on fossil fuels, but pensions also invest in the military industrial complex and lots of other things that are very, very harmful globally. And so I think on the divestment side, labor and unions have a very, very important role to play, and they're, what they say carries a lot of weight in the decisions that are made. And just on the good news, hopeful side, around the world, there have been 1,550 institutions around the world who have collectively committed to divesting $40.48 trillion from fossil fuels. And globally, pensions make up 11.9% of these divestment commitments. But there's also governments and philanthropic organizations and lots of things. There are lots of institutions that have committed to this global divestment from fossil fuels. So I would say divestment, whether it's fossil fuels or the military industrial complex or, nuclear weapons, private prison, anything, there's definitely a big role to play in the financial decisions and where we invest our money as a society.
Giselle, thank you. This next and I think final question from me is an invitation to the four of you to ask any question you might have of your other panelists. Is there something that you would like to ask someone else here with us today? Now we invite you to do so. Give you a second to think about that. Something that one of your colleagues has said that you would like to ask a follow-up question on. I'm an educator, so silences do not frighten me. I'll give you a few more minutes to think about it. You've had an incredible conversation with us and have been sharing connections a bit about your work. Some of you work together, you know each other well. What questions do you have for each other, particularly around this question of what do the rest of us need to learn from you as rising organizers? What questions would you pose to one another?
I guess I have a question for the other panelists around the need for nonviolent direct action, and just if nonviolent direct action is present in your work, if you think that, because there's kind of these insider-outsider strategies, or on one hand, we're trying to, you know, kind of appeal to these institutions and speak their language and have, you know, very high level like policy, you know, like within the current system, trying to change it kind of discussions. But then on the other hand, you know, there's this massive need for social movements and people out in the streets doing nonviolent protest. And I'm just wondering for the other panelists, what role you see nonviolent protest playing, and if you have any insight on, you know, this kind of insider-outsider strategy in terms of how we're going to make change.
Thanks, Giselle. Over to you, Nick, Sean, and Asya.
I'm going to jump in briefly because it does kind of segue into it. I think hopefully I'll be able to generate a question at the end of my answer too. Yeah, this is a yeah, it was a good question to ask us to ask questions to each other. Yeah, just briefly, I wanted to say, yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Giselle. Yeah, I've been involved in a lot of direct action, and I think it certainly has a role to play as both something that can interrupt the cogs of the machine, albeit briefly, and also something that brings people in and gets them to sort of take a commitment, and also signals that something is very important. So absolutely, I think it's a tactic among many that we need to be doing. And you sort of alluded to, yeah, the inside outside game type of mentality. I'm a firm believer that we all need to be doing many different things in order to take down, you know, this very behemoth kind of system that we're up against. Yes, and it made me wonder as well, sort of, I was trying to formulate a question around, like, you know, like Sean and Giselle, if I understood both of you correctly, you know, like you're working in sort of like a nonprofit space, and Asya, seems like a lot of your work has been maybe also in that space as well, but also with individual people, sort of that one-on-one working and building community, especially with people who have faced certain kinds of violence. And your initial question, Giselle, made me think as well too, like, you know, when we're thinking of all these different ways we can make change, how do you all think of balancing, you know, really working and committing one-on-one to people in a very deep way versus sort of a broad way where like a nonprofit might be able to reach a lot of people, but, you know, maybe a email listserv donor, you know, you don't know as well as, like, you know, your next door neighbor who you've been working on their, you know, working with them on a local neighborhood crisis or something. How do you all think about that balance?
Maybe I can jump in quick. Yeah, I agree completely. The inside outside, you need both approaches, and they both have their times and places, and it's hard to say sometimes exactly when that is. And I'm sure Asya could also share with us that in some cases there is no insider routes. You only have the outsider route, and the outsider route can also be very dangerous. You know, it could compromise lives of people, and it's difficult. But at the end of the day, especially when we talk about a liberal democratic society, inside outside is absolutely needed, and where it's possible to have both sides, we have to do both. When we talk then also about the kind of the individual versus the larger audience, I guess, or you know, who you're working with. Again, I think the answer is all of it. We have a lot to do, is the honest to God truth, and a lot of times the one-on-one approach really can be what makes a difference in someone's life, and then they can go on to expand the network, kind of a domino effect type thing, or just supporting people. But this is what I find very interesting about our work at the International Peace Bureau is, since we are an organization with members, we have members who are working on a national level, regional level, local levels too. We have organizations really that consist of peace educators who are working in schools and with a classroom of kids, and that is their audience, that's who they're working with. And then we have people who are trying to reach out to entire nations, and I think this combined approach through different ways to really bring it all together. And it's needed to not only have those different level activities going on, but to have them in contact with each other, to coordinate with each other, to have those working on a national level know what those are doing on the one-on-one or small group level, and to be able to be in communication with each other and support each other in those different efforts.
I'm sorry, my internet dropped. It's great to be back here with you. Sean, I just heard you answering a question, and I think you posed a question to your panelists.
I did not, but Nick did before me, so I think between two questions that
thank you. Asya or Giselle, did you have responses to Nick's questions?
I just wanted to add some words about the nonviolence protests. What I wanted to say that I can't yet judge about the success or successful strategies of nonviolence protests, because unfortunately I haven't yet seen a single peaceful protest in my country, peaceful protest or action that would end in success or result for the protestants, for the people who took part in the protest. But perhaps there is some critical number or volume of nonviolent protest upon reaching which one can observe meaningful results. Because no matter how strong, for example, military propaganda is, people still prefer calm and peace to war, anxiety, and fear. And any society strives for cooperation and dialogue. And this is a good resource and the ground for all the people who are striving to make nonviolent movements and to support this aspiration of the society and people.
Thank you, Asya. So I missed a stitch when my internet dropped. I want to make sure that those of you here, our panelists and guests, have had a chance to make any final responses before we close today. Okay. On behalf of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, I want to thank all of you who joined us today to listen to our guest panelist and to be a part of this vital conversation, and to the four of you who've joined from across the world and in the middle of lots of work. Appreciate your taking the time with us today. It's wonderful to have the chance to learn from your wisdom and to remind ourselves that there are levers, that there are ways that we can act, that there is a role for doing this together, and that in fact that's the only way we're going to make progress. So thank you for being in this work with us, for helping guide our work moving forward. And again, to all of you joining us today, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules for this important conversation. So this will conclude our time together. This recording will, I believe, be available on the website for the campaign